The November wind carried the first real bite of winter when Elena Volkov moved into the old farmhouse at the end of Maple Ridge Road. She arrived in a dented pickup truck loaded with tools, insulation rolls, and coils of heat tape that caught the afternoon light like copper snakes. The neighboring houses sat close enough to wave from porches, but far enough that each property felt like its own kingdom of frost-edged grass and skeletal trees. This was the kind of rural cluster where everyone knew everyone's business, where morning coffee at the general store doubled as the local news network, and where any deviation from the way things had always been done earned you a reputation. Elena was 42, compact and sturdy, with graying brown hair she kept in a practical bun and hands that showed decades of work. She moved with the economy of someone who'd learned not to waste motion. Her eyes were sharp and observant, constantly cataloguing details others missed: the angle of roof overhangs, the placement of downspouts, the direction prevailing winds carved through the valley. She'd grown up in a place where winter wasn't a season, but a test, where survival depended on preparation and the ability to anticipate what could go wrong 3 steps before it happened. The farmhouse she'd purchased was solid bones wrapped in peeling paint, a 2-story structure with good south-facing windows, and a well that had served the property for 80 years. The real estate agent had mentioned the well with pride, calling it reliable and deep. Elena had nodded politely and made notes about upgrading everything connected to it. Her first week was quiet industry. She hauled materials from her truck, climbed into the crawl space beneath the house with a flashlight, traced every inch of pipe from the well pump to the kitchen faucet. Neighbors watched from their yards as she dug shallow trenches, installed what looked like excessive amounts of foam insulation around exposed pipes, wrapped sections in silver heat tape, and mounted a small generator shed beside the house. Tom Bradshaw, who lived 3 properties down and considered himself the unofficial mayor of Maple Ridge Road, stopped by on day 4. "Getting settled?" he asked, leaning against his truck with the casual authority of someone whose family had been there for generations. "Working on it," Elena replied, not looking up from the junction box she was wiring near the well house. Tom watched her work for a moment, his expression sliding from neighborly to skeptical. "That's a lot of winterizing for pipes that have been fine for decades. The Hendersons never had to do all that." He gestured vaguely at the heat tape coils, the extra insulation, the small backup tank she was installing. Elena tightened a connector before answering. "Different approach. Looks expensive and kind of paranoid, if you don't mind me saying." Tom's laugh was meant to soften the words, but it carried an edge. "We get cold here, sure, but nothing these old systems can't handle. Been through plenty of winters without all that fuss." She met his eyes briefly. "I'm sure you have." Word spread quickly. At the general store, over the hum of the coffee maker and the crackle of the wood stove, the conversation turned to Elena's peculiar project. Sarah Chen, who'd lived on Maple Ridge for 15 years and prided herself on practical homesteading, had walked past Elena's property and seen the elaborate setup taking shape. "She's got heat tape wrapped around heat tape in some spots," Sarah told the morning coffee crowd, "and these weird drainage valves every few feet. Plus she's insulating the well house like it's a living space. It's overkill. Honestly, it looks amateur, like someone who read too many forums and got paranoid." Laughter rippled through the small group. Marcus Webb, a retired contractor, shook his head with the confidence of 40 years' experience. "That's what happens when city people move out here. They overcomplicate everything. Your pipes either work or they don't. All that extra stuff is just more points of failure." Tom added his observation about the generator and backup systems. "She's preparing for the apocalypse or something. Meanwhile, the rest of us will be fine like we've always been." The criticism took on a life of its own, becoming a running joke. When Elena came to the store for supplies, she'd hear the tail end of conversations that stopped when she entered. She felt the weight of their amusement, saw it in the knowing looks exchanged when she loaded her truck with additional materials in mid-November. But she didn't explain herself. She'd learned long ago that some people only understood preparation after they'd lived through catastrophe. Through November, Eleanor worked methodically. She installed low-point drains at strategic locations so she could evacuate sections of pipe if needed. She ran redundant heat tape circuits on separate breakers. She insulated not just the pipes themselves, but the spaces around them, creating thermal envelopes that would resist cold penetration. She tested her generator weekly, running it under load to ensure it could power the well pump and heat tape simultaneously. She marked shut-off valves with reflective paint so she could find them in darkness or blizzard conditions. Most importantly, she created what she called decision trees, mental maps of what to do if X failed, which backup kicked in, where the next failure point would be, how to isolate problems before they cascaded. She walked through scenarios in her mind while insulating pipes. Power fails, temperature drops to -15, wind chill pushes it lower, heat tape fails on the north side. What happens next? Her neighbors saw only the visible work, the excessive wrapping, the multiple redundancies, the paranoid preparation. They didn't see the logic tree underneath it all, the understanding that in deep cold, infrastructure didn't just stop working, it transformed. Metal became brittle, plastic cracked. Water, essential, life-giving water, turned solid and expansive, splitting anything that contained it. She'd seen it before, lived through winters where a single frozen pipe meant hauling water from a creek until spring, where mistakes killed livestock and put people in hospitals with hypothermia and dehydration. December arrived cold, not exceptional but steady, temperatures dropping into the teens at night, climbing to the high 20s during the day. Snow fell in that dry, persistent way that built up inch by inch, covering Maple Ridge Road in white that squeaked underfoot. Smoke rose straight from chimneys on calm days, bent horizontal when the wind picked up. Everyone's systems worked fine. Water ran. Pipes held. The neighborhood's skepticism about Eleanor's preparations solidified into certainty that she'd wasted time and money. Tom mentioned it to Marcus at the store during the third week of December. Haven't seen her around much. Probably embarrassed after all that unnecessary work. My pipes are fine. Yours fine? Running perfect, Marcus confirmed. Same as every year. Elena, for her part, was running daily checks. She measured temperatures in her crawl space, tested heat tape circuits, verified that her generator auto-start function worked correctly. She noted that during the cold snap at 18 degrees Fahrenheit, her heat tape had activated exactly as designed, maintaining pipe temperatures above freezing despite the ambient cold. She also noted something the Weather Service was tracking, a shift in the jet stream, an Arctic air mass building over northern Canada, temperatures forecasted to plummet in early January. The forecast appeared on the local news with clinical precision. Arctic outbreak, temperatures expected to fall to -15 Fahrenheit, wind chills approaching -35. The meteorologist used words like dangerous and life-threatening and limit time outdoors. For most people in the valley, it sounded extreme but manageable. Close vents, keep the heat running, stay inside. They'd been cold before. Elena saw something different in those numbers. She saw stress on every system people took for granted. She saw heat pumps struggling to keep up, furnaces running continuously, power grids straining under maximum demand. She saw exposed pipes in crawl spaces and garages, the weak points everyone forgot about until they failed. She saw the specific temperature, -15 Fahrenheit, which translated to -26 Celsius, as a threshold where the rules changed, where cold stopped being an inconvenience and became an active threat. She spent the days before the cold snap doing final preparations. She stocked extra propane for her backup heater. She filled bathtubs and containers with water as reserve. She verified that every valve worked, every circuit held, every backup system responded. She brought firewood up to the porch so she wouldn't have to venture far if she needed heat. She charged flashlights, batteries, phone. She prepared as if the infrastructure might fail, because she knew it could. The cold front arrived on January 2nd with shocking speed. The temperature fell 17 degrees in 4 hours. By evening, the thermometer outside Elena's kitchen window read 7 degrees Fahrenheit. By midnight, it had dropped to -2. The wind picked up around 2 in the morning, not the steady blow of normal weather, but the aggressive, probing gusts of Arctic air pushing south, finding every crack, every gap, every weakness in human defenses against the cold. Elena was awake, monitoring systems. She heard the generator kick on briefly when power flickered, heard it settle back to standby when the grid stabilized. She watched her heat tape indicators glowing steady green, showing current flowing through the resistance wire that kept her pipes above freezing. She checked the temperature in her crawl space, 38 degrees Fahrenheit, cold but still safely above the critical point. Outside, the wind made the old farmhouse creak and groan, testing joints and seals. 3 houses down, Sarah Chen was asleep when her power went out at 3:15 a.m. The outage lasted only 7 minutes, but it was enough. Her heat tape, which had been keeping the exposed pipes in her garage above freezing, went dark. The pipes began to cool immediately. By the time power returned, the temperature inside her garage had dropped to 18 degrees, and the pipes, uninsulated beyond basic building code requirements, were approaching the freezing point. The heat tape came back on, but it was playing catch-up now, trying to rewarm pipes that were losing the thermal battle. At 4 a.m. the temperature hit -8 Fahrenheit. At 5 a.m. it reached -12. At 6:30, as grey light began to leak into the eastern sky, it bottomed out at -15, exactly what the forecast had predicted. But the forecast hadn't fully captured the wind, which howled through the valley at 25 miles per hour with gusts to 40, driving the wind chill to -38. Tom Bradshaw woke to that wind rattling his windows and went to make coffee. He turned the kitchen faucet. Nothing came out. He tried the hot water. Nothing. A spike of concern pushed through his early morning fog. He went to the bathroom, tried that faucet. A dribble, then nothing. He descended to the basement, flashlight in hand, and found the problem immediately. A section of pipe near the foundation wall had frozen solid. The pipe hadn't burst yet, but it was only a matter of time. As the ice expanded, the pressure would build until something gave way. He tried to warm it with a hairdryer, but the cold had penetrated deep into the copper. The metal was too cold to touch with bare hands. He wrapped the section in towels and tried to direct heat at it, but at -15 outside, with wind driving cold through every microscopic gap in his foundation, he was fighting a losing battle. The pipe was frozen solid over a 6-foot section. By 8 a.m. the phone tree lit up. Sarah's pipes in the garage had frozen completely. Marcus discovered that his well pump, located in an underground pump house he'd considered adequately protected, had stopped working, either frozen or power cycled during the night. The Hendersons, the family Tom had mentioned as having no problems for decades, woke to find water pressure dropping rapidly as a pipe in their crawl space froze and cracked, hemorrhaging water into the insulation. The general store became crisis headquarters. People gathered not for coffee but for solutions, faces tight with stress. The temperature outside remained locked at -15, refusing to budge as the sun rose weak and pale in a sky scoured clean by the Arctic wind. "Anyone got water running?" Tom asked the group, his voice carrying an edge of desperation that hadn't been there a week ago. Marcus shook his head. "Pump's down. Can't get it restarted." Sarah looked exhausted. "My garage line split. I've got a bucket under it catching drips as it thaws, but that won't be for hours. Maybe days at this rate." The conversation turned to practical emergency measures, melting snow for toilet flushing, rationing bottled water for drinking, driving to town for supplies if the roads were passable. No one mentioned Elena. She'd become background noise, the weird newcomer whose excessive preparation had been fodder for jokes just weeks ago. At Elena's farmhouse, water was running. Not just running, but flowing with the steady pressure that meant every component of her system was functioning correctly. She turned on the kitchen faucet and filled a glass, watched the clear water swirl and settle. She knew, had felt in her bones, since the temperature began its fall, that this moment would come, not out of pride, but from experience and the hard mathematics of cold. She checked her systems again in full daylight. Crawlspace temperature, 36 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained by the combination of insulation, heat tape, and the strategic design that created a thermal buffer between the extreme outside cold and her pipes. Heat tape circuits, all green, all drawing current, all maintaining pipe temperatures at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to be efficient, warm enough to provide a buffer. Generator, on standby, fuel tank, 3/4 full. Backup water tank, full, available if needed. Low-point drains clear and accessible. Everything worked because she'd designed it to work at exactly these conditions. She'd built in redundancy not out of paranoia, but because she understood that at -15 Fahrenheit there was no margin for error. A single failure could cascade into catastrophe. Frozen pipes led to burst pipes led to flooding led to damage that would take months to repair, all while living without running water. She made coffee, ate breakfast, and considered her options. She could stay isolated, keep her head down, let her neighbors figure out their own solutions. She'd earned that right through their mockery. Or she could help, knowing that water in these conditions wasn't just about convenience. It was about survival. Dehydration in extreme cold was dangerous. People didn't drink enough because melting snow was tedious, and they didn't feel thirsty. But the dry Arctic air and the body's efforts to stay warm consumed moisture at frightening rates. At 10 a.m., she loaded a 5-gallon insulated container with water from her tap and drove slowly down the ice-rutted road to Tom's house. She knocked. He answered, looking haggard, wearing multiple layers and a hat indoors because he was trying to conserve heat. "I heard people were having trouble," Eleanor said, her voice neutral. "Brought some water if you need it." Tom stared at the container, then at her, his expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been shame. "Your water's working." "It is." "How?" She set the container down on his porch. "The setup you saw in November, it's designed for this." She paused, measuring her words carefully. "If you want to try warming that frozen section, you need to work from both ends toward the middle, not just blast one spot with heat. And you need to open the faucet slightly so expanding ice has somewhere to go as it melts. Otherwise, the pressure will split the pipe when you get it thawed." Tom nodded slowly, absorbing information he should have known, but hadn't thought through in his panic. We all thought you were overdoing it." "Different experiences," Elena said simply. She didn't add that she'd lived through 3 winters where temperatures hit -25 Celsius, the exact temperature they were experiencing now, where the conversion from Fahrenheit to Celsius landed at that brutal threshold. She didn't explain that she'd seen neighbors lose livestock, seen people hospitalized, seen the damage that extreme cold could do when preparation failed. She spent the day making rounds, bringing water to Sarah's house, helping Marcus troubleshoot his pump issue. Turned out the pressure switch had frozen, a simple fix if you knew what to look for. She talked the Hendersons through isolating their broken line and explained how to drain the damaged section so the leak wouldn't cause more damage as temperatures fluctuated. She didn't lecture, she didn't gloat. She just helped, sharing water and knowledge with the same practical efficiency she'd shown in November. By evening, as the temperature grudgingly climbed to -10, word had spread through the neighborhood that Elena's system, the weird, excessive, supposedly paranoid setup, was the only one still functioning normally. The next morning, people started showing up at her door with questions. How had she known to do this? Where did she learn it? Could she help them figure out how to upgrade their systems before the next cold snap? She invited them in, made coffee with her abundant running water, and spread out a simple diagram on her kitchen table. "It's not complicated," she explained, "but it requires thinking ahead. You need to identify every weak point, where pipes are exposed, where they run through unheated spaces, where they're vulnerable to wind. Then you need layers of protection, insulation, heat tape, backup power. And you need redundancy, because at -25 Celsius, you can't afford a single point of failure." Tom looked at the diagram, tracing the paths she'd marked. "We should have listened." Elena shook her head. "You didn't have the experience, I did. That's not your fault." She paused, choosing her next words with care. "But now you do have the experience. Now you know what -15 feels like, what it does to systems you thought were solid. The question is what you do with that knowledge." The cold snap lasted 4 more days. Each night, temperatures plunged to -12 or lower. Each morning brought new disasters on properties that hadn't been prepared. Cracked fittings, split valves, failed pumps. Eleanor's system never faltered. Her pipes kept flowing, her heat tape kept working. Her redundancies meant that when the power went out for 3 hours on day 5, her generator carried the load without hesitation. She measured her water temperature one morning out of curiosity, just to confirm what she already knew. Even with the outside temperature at -15 Fahrenheit and wind howling through the valley, the water coming out of her tap was 48 degrees, cold but liquid, safe, usable. The temperature differential between that water and the air outside was 63 degrees, maintained by insulation, heat tape, thermal planning, and the understanding that preparation wasn't paranoia. It was respect for nature's power to harm. By the time the cold finally broke, climbing back into the teens and then the 20s, the neighborhood had changed. The mockery was gone, replaced by something closer to respect, though tinged with embarrassment. People came to Elena not just for water, but for advice, for help rebuilding their systems to withstand the next test. She helped when she could, sharing her knowledge freely. She explained the concept of thermal envelopes, the importance of redundancy, the need to test systems before crisis hit. She showed them her decision trees, the mental maps she'd created that told her what to do when something failed. She taught them to think not in terms of if, but when, because in deep winter, failure wasn't a possibility. It was a certainty if you didn't plan for it. Sarah came by with a notebook full of questions about insulation values and heat tape specifications. Marcus brought measurements of his pump house and asked for help redesigning it. Tom, perhaps feeling his unofficial mayor status required making amends, organized a neighborhood meeting where Elena walked everyone through winterization basics. The key, she explained to the group gathered in Tom's living room, is understanding that infrastructure isn't permanent. It's only as good as the conditions it was designed for. Most systems around here were built for typical winters, cold but manageable. They weren't built for -25 Celsius. That's a different animal. She wrote the numbers on a whiteboard. -15 Fahrenheit equals -26 Celsius. At these temperatures, everything changes. Metal contracts. Plastic becomes brittle. Water doesn't just freeze, it expands with incredible force. A completely frozen pipe can generate pressures of 2,000 pounds per square inch. That's enough to split cast iron. Copper doesn't stand a chance. The room was silent, everyone absorbing information they should have known but had never needed before. Eleanor continued, her tone matter-of-fact. You can't fight this kind of cold with hope or tradition, or it's always worked before. You fight it with planning, redundancy, and constant vigilance. You assume things will fail and you prepare for the failure. That's not paranoia. That's survival. Over the following weeks, as temperatures moderated and people repaired their damaged systems, Elena noticed a shift. Her neighbors no longer saw her as the weird newcomer with excessive habits. They saw her as someone who understood something they were only beginning to grasp. That comfort and safety weren't guaranteed, that modern conveniences were fragile, that the difference between working infrastructure and disaster was preparation done months in advance. The general store conversations changed too. Instead of jokes about her elaborate systems, people discussed their own upgrade plans. Sarah showed off her new insulation project. Marcus rebuilt his pump house with double walls and proper heat tape. The Hendersons hired a contractor to reroute exposed pipes into better protected spaces. Elena watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction, though she knew the real test would come next winter, and the winter after that. Knowledge was one thing. Implementation and maintenance were another. People tended to be diligent immediately after a crisis, then slowly relaxed as time passed and comfort returned. The true measure would be whether they maintained their vigilance when winter seemed distant and the memory of frozen pipes had faded. One evening in late January, with temperatures back in the 30s and the worst of the season hopefully behind them, Tom stopped by Elena's house. He carried a bottle of decent whiskey and an expression that suggested this wasn't a casual visit. "Can I come in?" he asked. Elena stepped aside and led him to the kitchen. She got glasses while he opened the bottle and poured 2 modest drinks. "I owe you an apology," Tom said without preamble. "We mocked you. I mocked you. We thought you were paranoid or naive or both. And you saved us, not just with the water but with your knowledge and your willingness to help even after we'd been asses about it." Eleanor took a sip of whiskey, letting the warmth spread through her chest. "You didn't know. Now you do. That's what matters. Where did you learn it? You never really explained." She was quiet for a moment, memories surfacing like cold spring water. I grew up in a place where winter could kill you if you weren't prepared. Rural, isolated, temperatures that made -15 look mild. We learned young that nature doesn't care about your plans or your comfort. It just does what it does. Your job is to be ready. Why didn't you tell us this in November? Would you have listened? Elena asked gently. Tom laughed, a short bark with no humor in it. No, probably not. Some lessons have to be learned the hard way. I could have given you all a lecture about Arctic cold snaps and thermal protection, but it would have been abstract. You needed to feel what -15 does to unprepared systems. You needed to experience the panic of turning a faucet and getting nothing. Now those numbers mean something to you. Now when you see -25 in a forecast, you'll feel it in your gut. They sat in companionable silence, sipping whiskey while the refrigerator hummed and water dripped from icicles outside the window. Finally, Tom asked, "What would you have done if your system had failed?" Elena considered the question seriously. I had 75 gallons of backup water stored. I had a plan to melt snow safely. I knew which neighbors I could ask for help if things went completely wrong, and I knew how to ration water to last 10 days in an emergency. The system didn't fail because I built it not to fail, but I planned for the possibility anyway. Redundancy, Tom said, testing out the word. Redundancy, Elena confirmed, and respect for the cold. Once you understand that water transitioning from liquid to solid below 32 Fahrenheit, or 0 Celsius depending on how you measure, is an unstoppable force, you plan accordingly. You don't fight it, you work around it. As Tom left, stepping out into the clear, cold night where stars burned bright in the frozen air, Elena reflected on the past month. She thought about the moment her neighbors had gone from mockery to respect, that pivot point when her weird plumbing had transformed from joke to salvation. She thought about the specific sound of running water at -15 Fahrenheit, musical and miraculous in its simple reliability, the sound of preparation meeting crisis and holding firm. She thought about the broader meaning too, the lessons that extended beyond pipes and heat tape. In a world increasingly prone to extremes, where climate patterns shifted and old certainties crumbled, preparation wasn't optional. The past couldn't be trusted as a guide to the future. What had worked for decades might fail spectacularly tomorrow. The only security was in anticipating change, in building systems that could withstand stresses they'd never encountered, in maintaining vigilance even when everything seemed fine. Her plumbing wasn't weird. It was adapted to reality, the reality that nature would test human systems, that comfort was fragile, that the difference between flowing water and frozen disaster was preparation done in November for a crisis that arrived in January. The neighbors who'd laughed had learned, and now they were adapting too, building their own redundancies, creating their own buffers against the next test. Elena finished her whiskey and rinsed the glass under running water, still flowing, still reliable, still exactly what it needed to be. She looked out the window at the dark shapes of her neighbors' houses, at the smoke rising from their chimneys, at the landscape locked in winter's grip. Tomorrow would be warmer. The forecast showed temperatures climbing into the 40s by midweek, the crisis passing like storms always did, but she would keep running her weekly system checks. She would keep her heat tape ready. She would keep her generator maintained and her backup supplies stocked. Because she knew something her neighbors were just learning, the cold would always come back. Maybe not this week, maybe not this year, but eventually. And when it did, she would be ready. That readiness, that constant preparation, wasn't burden or paranoia. It was freedom. The freedom to face winter on her own terms, with systems she trusted and knowledge hard-won through experience. The weird plumbing had become something else entirely. It had become a philosophy, a way of seeing the world that recognized both human ingenuity and natural power, that prepared for the worst while hoping for the best, that understood resilience wasn't luck, but design. And as the stars wheeled overhead, and the temperature held steady in the low 30s, Elena went to bed knowing that her water would still be running in the morning, that her systems would hold, that she had done what needed doing when it needed doing. The neighborhood would remember this winter. They would remember the cold that reached -25 Celsius and locked the valley in its grip. They would remember frozen pipes and emergency measures and the panic of infrastructure failure. But most of all, They would remember that water kept flowing at one house, maintained by a system they'd once called weird, designed by a woman they'd once dismissed, proving that respect for nature's power and careful preparation weren't signs of fear but of wisdom. That lesson, like the cold itself, would leave a mark that lasted well beyond winter. And as the season slowly turned towards spring, as the ice began its long retreat and the earth remembered warmth, Elena's pipes kept running, steady, reliable, ready for whatever came next. Because in the end, that was what preparation meant. Not living in fear of the future, but building systems that could face it without breaking, maintaining vigilance not out of paranoia, but out of respect for forces larger than yourself, and understanding that when nature tested your readiness, the answer couldn't be improvised in the moment. It had to be built into the foundation, woven into every decision, maintained through every season, especially the comfortable ones when the danger seemed distant and the memory of crisis began to fade. The weird plumbing stayed weird only to those who hadn't felt what -15 Fahrenheit could do. To everyone else it became simply smart. And in that transformation lay the real story of Elena's winter on Maple Ridge Road. Not a tale of superior knowledge or vindication, but a reminder that sometimes the difference between disaster and safety is the willingness to prepare when no one else thinks it's necessary, and to help when the crisis finally comes, even if you were right all along. If this story resonated with you, and you want to hear more real-life survival stories about people who prepared when others doubted, subscribe to the channel. We explore the moments where planning meets crisis, where unconventional thinking saves the day, and where quiet resilience proves stronger than conventional wisdom. Hit that subscribe button and join us for the next story.